Genoa has almost no farmland. Behind the city, the mountains begin within a few streets of the water. They climb more than 1,000 meters in the first 5 kilometers. There is no plain here. There is no river worth the name. Of Liguria's 5,500 square kilometers, more than 3,500 are mountain, another 900 are hill. And yet, by the middle of the 14th century, this city was eating bread made from grain carried across the Black Sea, not from a valley inland, not from a delta a day's ride away, from 1,000 miles east by ship, in bulk, every single year. The records survive. In 1358, the treasury logged more than 800 tons of wheat arriving from the western Black Sea coast. By 1384, one Genoese colony in Crimea was supplying over a third of everything the city ate. Both things are true at the same time. This ground could not feed a village, and the city standing on it fed itself, then fed others, for 600 years. Which leaves one question: why is there a city here at all? Start with the shape of the place. Genoa runs about 30 kilometers along the coast. It reaches barely 10 kilometers inland. Everything else is slope. The center sits at around 39 meters above the sea, and from there, the ground goes up in every direction that is not water. Stand at the harbour and turn your back to it. The wall in front of you is the Apennines. Not distant, not a blue shape on the horizon. Close enough that on a clear morning you can see individual trees on the ridge. This is the tightest relief on the whole Italian coast. In some stretches west of the city, the ground rises over 1,100 meters in 5 kilometers from the shoreline. That is steeper than anything in the Scottish Highlands. It is happening here in the space of a suburb. Now look along the water. The Ligurian coast runs for hundreds of kilometers, and almost all of it is cliff. High, hard, and unbroken. There are small beaches, there are coves, but deep, sheltered, workable natural harbours, the kind that can hold a fleet through a winter storm, exist in exactly 2 places on this coastline. One is La Spezia, at the far eastern end. The other is here. So the site is not an accident. It is a shortage, a gap in a wall of stone opening onto the only good water for 200 kilometers in either direction. That is where people put a city. Not because the land was generous, because the land offered one door, and this was it. The sea in front of that door is not empty either. A few kilometers out from the cranes and the container stacks, the seabed falls away. The continental shelf here is narrow, cut through by submarine canyons, and beyond it, the water drops past 2,500 meters. That depth, and the currents that move through it, feed one of the richest stretches of open water in the Mediterranean. Which is why, in summer, fin whales come here. The fin whale is the second largest animal that has ever lived. In the Mediterranean, it exists as its own population, separate from the Atlantic, and this basin is its main feeding ground. They arrive to strain krill from water that Upwelling has lifted from 150 meters down, thick with nitrates and phosphates that never reach the surface anywhere else nearby in this quantity. They are enormous, slow at the surface, and almost impossible to see until the blow goes up, a column of vapor standing 4 or 5 meters above flat water. And they are doing this within sight of one of the busiest working ports in Europe. The same steep, sudden underwater terrain that gave Genoa its harbour is what brings the whales close enough to see from a ferry deck. Hold on to that, it comes back. To understand why the land refuses to grow anything, you have to go back a long way, considerably further back than the city. The rock under Liguria is not ordinary continental rock. Large parts of it are ocean floor. Around 165 million years ago, there was a sea here that no longer exists. Geologists call it the Ligurian Tethys. It opened between the ancient landmasses that would eventually become Europe and Africa, and it spread slowly, the way the slowest ridges on Earth spread today. So slowly that in places, the crust never fully formed. Mantle rock was simply unroofed and exposed on the seabed, then covered in pillow lava where magma reached the water. Then the ocean closed. As the plates converged, slices of that sea floor were not pushed down into the mantle. They were scraped off and shoved upward onto the edge of the continent. Peridotite that formed tens of kilometers deep now sits in daylight on Ligurian hillsides. Radiolarian chert, hardened ooze made from the skeletons of plankton that died in deep water, is exposed in road cuttings. These rock bodies are called ophiolites, and the ones along this coast are among the most studied in the world. They are part of the reason geologists understood in the 20th century that ocean crust could be lifted onto land at all. For a farmer, none of this is good news. Ophiolitic ground is thin, stony, magnesium-rich, and often serpentinized. Many plants struggle in it. It weathers into shallow soil that sits on steep slopes with nothing to hold it. Add rainfall that, in the Genoese catchments, can exceed 2,000 millimeters a year, and in the worst years 3,000, and the soil does not stay. It moves downhill. It always has. So the settlement problem here is not simply that the land is steep. It is that the land is steep, the rock is poor, and the rain is heavy. Three conditions that arrive together and reinforce one another. Genoa was never going to be a farming town. That was decided before there were people. But people came anyway, and they did the only thing available to them. They cut the slope into steps. Along this coast, for centuries, families rebuilt the hillsides by hand. They stacked stone into retaining walls without mortar, backfilled behind them, and made flat ground where none existed. Then they did it again, above and below, until whole mountainsides had been converted into staircases. The scale of it is difficult to hold in your head. In the Cinque Terre alone, east of the city, the terracing involved reworking millions of cubic meters of loose slope material and building thousands of kilometers of dry stone wall. Not built once. Maintained, wall by wall, generation after generation. It is one of the largest hand-built landscapes in the Mediterranean, and nobody designed it. It accumulated, one terrace at a time, because the alternative was no food. The walls do two jobs at once. They hold the soil in place, and because they are dry stacked, water drains through them instead of pooling behind them. A well-kept terrace absorbs a downpour and releases it slowly. The hillside stays where it is. Which raises a question that will not stay quiet. What happens to a slope that has been rebuilt by hand for 600 years when the hands stop? Keep that one. It gets answered later, and the answer is measured in cubic meters. The other thing a place like this produces is a very particular way of eating. Ligurian food is famous now. It was not designed to be. It is what people cooked when the land gave them almost nothing and the sea gave them the rest. Start with bread. Wheat needs flat, deep, well-watered ground, and Liguria has essentially none. So the region turned to chickpeas. Ground chickpea flour, mixed with water, olive oil and salt, poured thin into a copper pan and baked hard in a wood-fired oven, becomes farinata. Crisp at the edge, soft in the middle, and cheap enough to feed a dock worker for a morning. The same flour, cooked into a paste and cooled, becomes panissa. It is a bread substitute invented by a place that could not grow bread. Then there are the herbs. Because the slopes are dry, sunny, and thin-soiled, they grow aromatic plants extremely well. Marjoram, thyme, sage, rosemary, borage, and a dozen wild greens gathered together under one word: prebogion. There is no fixed recipe. It is whatever the hillside is offering that week, foraged, boiled, and folded into pies and pasta fillings. Meat is scarce, and it shows. Ligurian menus are famously short on main courses because the terrain supports rabbits and chickens and not much else. Meat became a flavouring rather than a centre. Salted cod, brought in from far colder waters, did the protein work along the coast. In the hills, chestnuts did the work of grain. And then there is basil. On the slopes at Pra, west of the city, families have grown basil under glass since at least 1827. The plants there are small, and the leaves are intensely scented, a product of the specific ground, the specific light, and the specific salt in the air. Crushed in a marble mortar with pine nuts, garlic, olive oil, and cheese, they make the sauce this city is known for worldwide. The cheese in it is not Ligurian. The traditional pecorino came from Sardinia by boat, which is the whole region in one bowl. The green comes from the hillside because that is all the hillside will give. Everything that needs real farmland was imported by sea. A cuisine built out of what was missing. And that is the pattern to watch for from here on. Not once, everywhere. Every distinctive thing about this place, the food, the streets, the buildings, the ships, and eventually the money, is the shape left behind by something the land refused to provide. Consider the problem of simply getting home. A city built on a shelf 10 kilometres deep, with mountains behind it, cannot spread outward. So it went up. Not metaphorically, structurally. Genoa is stacked. Buildings climb the slope in tiers, and the streets between them frequently stop being streets and become stairs. There are addresses in this city that no vehicle has ever reached. There are neighbourhoods where the front door of one building is level with the fourth floor of the one below it. Which is why the city runs a public transport network that most cities do not need. Genoa has funiculars, rack railways, and public lifts operating as ordinary municipal transport. The same ticket, the same timetable, the same commuters. The Zecca Rigi funicular climbs 278 metres from the edge of the old centre to the hills above it, in about a quarter of an hour, in stages. One lift, the Castello d'Albertis Montegaletto, starts as a horizontal car running through a tunnel into the hillside, then stops and rises vertically through the rock. Elsewhere that is a novelty ride. Here it is how you get to work. The gradients also decide the light. Many of these buildings are 6 or 7 stories, and they were built that high on plots barely wide enough to justify it, because the flat ground was measured in meters, not blocks. The result is a city of extremely tall, extremely narrow buildings, packed against each other on a slope. Look up from certain streets down by the harbour, and the sky is a strip. 2 meters of blue, 6 floors overhead. There is a reason for that, and it is not medieval charm. It comes back later, with numbers. Out beyond the breakwater, meanwhile, the water keeps producing surprises. Striped dolphins are the most numerous cetacean in this basin, and they behave nothing like the dolphins people picture from harbours and bays. They are open water animals. They avoid the shallows. They travel in groups that can number in the hundreds, moving fast over depths of 1,000 meters or more, hunting small fish and squid that rise toward the surface at night. They are marked with a dark stripe running from the eye back along the flank, splitting into a blade shape across the body, which is where the name comes from, and which is often the only thing you see, because they surface at speed and do not linger. What matters here is where they are. Off most Mediterranean coasts, a boat has to travel a long way to reach water deep enough for them. Off Genoa, that water starts almost immediately. The shelf is so narrow and the drop so abrupt that a species which needs the open ocean is effectively a coastal animal here. The land steepness does not stop at the shoreline. It keeps going, underwater, and everything living in that column is arranged around it. Now for the part that changes everything. The Apennine chain runs the length of Italy. It is continuous, it is high, and for most of its length it is a genuine barrier, one that separated the Mediterranean coast from the great agricultural basin of the north, the Po Plain, where the grain and the cities and the money were. But the chain is not the same height everywhere. It sags. And the lowest sag on the entire northern stretch sits directly behind Genoa. There are several crossings here. The Bocchetta Pass stands at 772 meters. Further west, the Turchino. Further west still, the Bocchetta di Altare at 436 meters, which is where geologists draw the boundary between the Alps and the Apennines. And north of the city, up the Polcevera Valley, the Giovi Pass, 472 meters. Those numbers do not sound dramatic. That is exactly the point. This is the place where the wall gets low enough to walk a loaded mule over. 148 BC. Roman engineers are cutting a road north from the port they call Genoa, over the high ground, down toward the town of Dertona and the plain beyond. They call it the Via Postumia. It runs the width of northern Italy, sea to sea, and this coastal gap is one of the reasons it can exist at all. It is the first formal recognition of what Genoa actually is, not a farming settlement, a crossing point. The passes never stopped mattering. 14 centuries after that road, in 1447, Genoa granted the Bocchetta route exclusive rights over salt shipments moving inland, because whoever held the pass held the trade, and salt was the trade that never stopped. For most of the medieval period, the traffic moved on mule tracks. Loads were small, the climbs were brutal, but the alternative was the long way around the entire mountain chain, and nobody chose that twice. To reach the passes, though, you first have to get out of the city, and there are only two ways to do that. Genoa sits between two watercourses. To the west, the Polcevera, to the east, the Bisagno. Neither is a river in the ordinary sense. They are torrents, running perpendicular from the ridge straight down to the sea, dry or nearly dry for much of the year, catastrophic for the rest of it. Their valleys are the only breaks in the mountain wall wide enough to move through. So the entire history of this city funnels into two narrow corridors. The Polcevera Valley became the main inland route toward the Po Plain. The Bisagno Valley carried the eastern approach. Roads went up them. Later, railways. Later still, motorways, on viaducts and through tunnels, because there was no other geometry available. And because those valleys were the only flattish ground anywhere near the city, they also filled with buildings, warehouses, factories, housing. The industrial west of Genoa grew along the Polcevera. Residential districts spread up the Bisagno. Which means the city put its transport arteries, its industry, and a large share of its population into the two channels that the mountain uses to shed water. That decision has a cost. It is paid, on average, every 15 or 20 years. But before that comes due, go back out to sea. Because the same steep geometry that shaped the valleys does something extraordinary underwater. The Ligurian basin is not a shallow shelf sea. Off this coast, the seafloor is a landscape of canyons and seamounts, dropping past 2,500 meters, in places approaching 2,700. A permanent circulating current runs through it. Where that current meets the canyon walls and the shape of the bottom, water is forced upward. That process is called upwelling, and it is the engine of everything alive out there. Nutrients sink. That is the ordinary state of the ocean. Dead material drifts down, and the nitrates and phosphates it carries end up in cold, dark water where nothing photosynthesizes. Most of the Mediterranean is famously poor in life for exactly this reason. The nutrients are there, but they are down. Here, they come back up. Water from 100 to 200 meters down is lifted into the sunlit layer, and the plankton bloom that follows supports a food chain that ends in animals weighing 70 tons. In 1999, Italy, France, and Monaco drew a boundary around it. The Pelagos Sanctuary covers roughly 90,000 square kilometers and more than 2,000 kilometers of coast, and it was the first marine protected area in the world to include international waters. All 8 cetacean species that live in the Mediterranean are found inside it, including one that almost nobody ever sees. Cuvier's beaked whale is a deep-diving animal that spends the overwhelming majority of its life below the surface. It hunts squid in the dark, and it does so at depths that were considered impossible for an air-breathing mammal until the measurements came in. Dives beyond 2 kilometers have been recorded, single dives lasting over 2 hours. To do that, the animal collapses its lungs on the way down, stores oxygen in its muscle rather than its blood, and shuts circulation to everything that does not need it. It comes up, breathes for a few minutes, and goes back. It can live here because the canyons are here. Take away the underwater terrain, and the animal has no habitat. It is the clearest possible illustration of the rule this whole place runs on. The shape of the ground decides who gets to live on it, above the waterline and below it. There is a way this city is usually described, and it is worth naming because it is almost exactly backwards. Genoa is told as a story about ambition, a proud republic, a maritime power, a place that chose the sea and mastered it. The city's own nickname encourages this, La Superba, the proud one. Every account leans on the same word: bold merchants, daring captains, a city that looked at the horizon and decided to take it. But nobody in Genoa chose the sea. The mountains chose it for them. A settlement with grain fields does not build a fleet. A settlement with a river does not spend 6 centuries perfecting long-distance shipping. Those things are what you build when there is no field and no river, and the water is the only surface you can move a heavy load across. The ambition is real. It is also downstream of a shortage. And you can see the shortage from any hill above the port. Which brings us to the tower on the western headland. The lanterna stands on a rock at the harbour mouth, and it has been guiding ships into this gap for longer than most countries have existed. The tower standing there now dates to the 16th century, rebuilt after the earlier structure was damaged. It is over 70 meters tall, on a base already high above the water, and for centuries it was among the tallest lighthouses anywhere. It has become the city's symbol, not the cathedral, not a palace, the thing that tells sailors where the entrance is. and ships needed telling because the approach is not gentle. The Gulf of Genoa is one of the more difficult stretches of the Mediterranean, and the reason is the same mountain wall. Cold air spills down off the Apennines and meets the warm surface of the Gulf. That contrast drives a persistent tendency for low pressure to form right here, over this water, against this coast. The winds that result have their own names. The libeccio comes from the southwest, piling up sea against the shore. The tramontana comes down over the ridge from the north, cold and dry and sudden, and can turn a calm harbour rough in under an hour. Sailors from this coast learned those winds the way farmers elsewhere learned soil. And along the rest of the coastline, the same lesson repeats in miniature. East of the city, the Portofino promontory pushes out into the sea, one of the only genuine headlands on a coast that is otherwise a long, high line. Behind it sits a bay, and in that bay sits a village that became one of the most photographed places in Italy. It exists because a piece of harder rock refused to erode at the same rate as everything around it. Just around from it, Camogli is wedged into a fold in the cliff, its houses stacked so tightly and painted so brightly that fishermen could identify their own from open water. Closer in, Boccadasse is a fishing cove that the city grew around without ever flattening. A strip of shingle, a curve of houses, and behind them the slope going straight up. At the far eastern end of Liguria, Portovenere guards the entrance to the region's only other true harbour. West of Genoa, Voltri and Sestri Ponente hold the industry because they sit on the widest scraps of flat ground the coast has. Nervi, to the east, has cliffs and parks and almost nothing level at all. Inland, the ridge road runs above all of it. From the Passo del Faiallo, 1,044 meters up, you can see the sea on one side and the green interior of Piedmont on the other in a single turn of the head. On the northern slope, Gavi and Busala sit in the valleys that feed toward the plain. The whole region is legible from a high point: sea, a thin edge of habitation, and then rock. West of Savona, the character of the wall changes. At the Bocchetta di Altare, 436 meters, marked by a bronze plaque set into stone, the Apennines end and the Ligurian Alps begin. It is one of the few places in Europe where two named mountain systems meet at a specific, agreed spot. And it happens on this coast because the whole geological argument of northern Italy is compressed into a strip a few dozen kilometers wide. What that wall does for the coast, though, is not only obstruction. Because the mountains stand directly behind the shoreline, they block the cold air moving down from the north for most of the year. The sea in front holds its heat into the winter. Between them, the narrow coastal strip is left with a climate that does not belong at this latitude. Winter averages along the Riviera sit around 7 to 10 degrees. Summers hold near 23 or 24. Palms grow on the promenades. Citrus and magnolia grow in the gardens. Around San Remo, west of Genoa, the whole local economy turned to cut flowers, grown outdoors in February on a coastline that sits further north than Florence. It is the one gift the terrain gives freely. The same wall that removed the farmland created a sheltered ribbon warm enough to grow olives, lemons, and grapes on ground with almost no depth to it. Everything soft about this coast exists because something hard is standing behind it. But go over the ridge and inland, and the story changes character entirely. The Ligurian interior is not empty because nobody ever lived there. It is empty because they left. Behind the coast, the Apennine valleys carry beech forest, silver fir, chestnut woods, and stone villages that once held real populations. These were working mountains. Chestnuts were flower. Timber was fuel and ships. Sheep grazed the high meadows. Every terrace on every slope was cut by somebody who needed it. Then, through the 20th century, the people went. Some went to the coast, where the work was. Many went much further. Liguria has one of the strongest emigration histories in Italy, and one destination above all others. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Ligurians left for Argentina in such numbers that they permanently marked the food, the speech, and the neighborhoods of Buenos Aires. An entire quarter of that city was built by people from this coast. A region whose land could not hold its own population exported it instead. That is not a metaphor. It was the mechanism. It had happened before in a smaller and more famous way. Around 1451, a wool weaver's son was born in this city. He grew up in a place where every ambitious young man went to sea because there was no other career ladder available, and where the harbour was full of people who had been to Chios, to the Crimea, to North Africa, to the Atlantic coast of Iberia. Christopher Columbus left Genoa and never worked for it. He sailed for a foreign crown from a foreign port, which is entirely typical. Genoa's most valuable export for centuries was skilled people who left. The land could not employ them, and the sea could. What remains inland now is quiet. Villages that held a few hundred people hold a few dozen. Chestnut groves have gone to scrub. The terraces above them are still visible from the air, long horizontal lines running across the hillsides, softened by trees, marking fields nobody has worked in 70 years. And into that silence, something came back. The wolf had been driven out of most of northern Italy, persecuted, poisoned, shot, and reduced across the 20th century to a remnant in the central and southern mountains. In the Ligurian Apennines, it was gone. Then the villages emptied. Farmland turned to woodland. Roe deer and wild boar expanded into ground that no longer had anyone farming it. And the wolf followed the prey north along the chain, valley by valley, without any reintroduction program, without release pens, without help. They are back in these mountains now, rarely seen, mostly detected through tracks, camera traps, and scat. It is an uncomfortable kind of recovery. The animal returned because the human landscape collapsed. The forest that shelters it is the same forest that swallowed the terraces. What the wolf demonstrates is the rule running underneath everything here. Nothing on this coast is choosing. The land offers conditions, and whatever can meet them moves in. When people could work the slope was fields, and there were no wolves. When they stopped, the slope became woodland, and the wolves came. The terrain did not change its mind. Only the occupants changed. There is a smaller resident of these hills that made the opposite journey. The honeybee of this region is its own subspecies, known to beekeepers as the Ligurian bee. It evolved on a peninsula of long warm seasons, short mild winters, and a landscape where flowering plants are scattered across broken ground rather than concentrated in fields. That shaped its behaviour. It forages widely and persistently, builds up its colony fast in spring, keeps a small cluster through a winter that rarely bites hard, and is famously calm to handle. Those traits are all answers to a specific hillside, but they turned out to be useful almost everywhere. From the 19th century, colonies from this part of Italy were shipped out to beekeepers across Europe, North America, and Australia. On Kangaroo Island, off the south coast of Australia, a population brought over in the 1880s was deliberately protected by law from any further imports and has been kept isolated ever since, a sealed remnant of Ligurian stock on an island on the other side of the world. A bee, shaped by the flowering slopes above Genoa, is now the working animal of orchards it will never see. The land here has always exported what it could not keep: sailors, weavers, farmers, and, in this case, insects. Which returns us to the oldest problem this city ever had: the bread. A settlement that cannot grow grain has three options: shrink to what the hillside supports, take grain from someone who has it, or buy it. Genoa did the third, at a scale that reorganized the Western Mediterranean. The first source was close. Sardinia, a day or two south, with real farmland, supplied grain, and with it sheep, salt, and enslaved people. That trade taught the Genoese the shape of the problem. Buying food across water requires ships, and ships require crews, cargoes on the return leg, agreements about who bears the loss when a vessel is lost, and money that can move faster than the goods. So they built the tools. Contracts that let an investor fund a voyage without sailing on it. Arrangements that split a ship into shares so that a modest sum could buy a fraction of a cargo. Rules that spread the cost of jettisoned goods across everyone with an interest in the vessel. Ordinary people with small savings could put money into a voyage. None of that was invented for glory. It was invented because a city on a rock ledge needed a guaranteed wheat supply and could not get one on credit and goodwill alone. And once you have that machinery, you do not stay near home. Genoese fleets pushed east, past Sicily, past the Aegean, through the Straits and into the Black Sea, where the grain plains of the north drained down to a handful of ports. At Kaffa, on the Crimean coast, and at Tana, on the Sea of Azov, they built warehouses and walls and stayed. The numbers are documented. In 1358, the Republic's treasury recorded more than 800 tons of wheat arriving from the western Black Sea coast alone. In 1384, Kaffa sent 31,000 measures, over a third of everything Genoa imported that year. Those same ports handled another cargo: grain, furs, wax, and people. Men, women, and children were bought and sold at Kaffa and Tana and carried west in Genoese hulls. It was not incidental to the trade. It was part of it, recorded in the same ledgers, taxed by the same authorities. Then, in the 1340s, the weather turned. A run of poor years across southern Europe, driven in part by volcanic dust cooling the atmosphere, collapsed harvests between 1345 and 1347. Famine spread through Italy. The maritime republics did the only thing they were built to do. They reached further and they bought harder, activating the long-distance grain network to bring wheat back from the Sea of Azov in 1347. It worked. Large parts of Italy did not starve. And the ships brought something else back with the grain. The plague bacterium travelled west out of the Black Sea in cargo holds, in the rats and fleas that lived in bulk wheat. It reached Mediterranean harbours in 1347, and from those harbours it moved through Europe faster than any authority could respond. Within a few years, a third of the continent was dead. The system that kept a city fed on ground that could not feed it is the same system that carried the Black Death to Europe's door. Both facts belong to the same ships. Let that sit. There is no version of this where the trade was good and the consequence was separate. Now come back to the water falling on the mountain. Everything about the Genoese catchments is short and steep. The Bisagno drains a basin only a few dozen kilometres across, and it falls from ridge to sea in a very small horizontal distance. Rain that lands high does not meander, it arrives. In these valleys, the gap between peak rainfall and peak river flow can be under an hour. That is the mechanism. Add the weather. The mountain wall standing over a warm sea generates its own storms. Moist air is forced upward by the terrain, cold air spills down from the ridge, and low pressure parks over the gulf. Rainfall figures in these catchments regularly pass 2,000 millimeters a year, and in the worst years exceed 3,000. In October 2014, gauges in the Bisagno Basin recorded peaks close to 140 millimeters in a single hour, and more than 550 millimeters in 24. Then there is what the city did to the stream. As Genoa grew, it needed the flat ground of the valley floor, so it built over the Bisagno. The final 1.5 kilometers of the watercourse runs underneath the city through a covered channel beneath streets and a railway station. A torrent that can deliver a year of British rainfall in a day, funneled into a tunnel. The floods are not new. The Republic's own annals log them. 1404, 1407, 1414, 1416, 1420, 1452, 1465, 1582, and again through the 18th century in 1746, 1780, 1787, and 1790. The city has always known what this stream does. In October 1970, the Bisagno overtopped and flooded the centre in what remains the worst event on record. In September 1992, it came again, and destroyed arches of the Sant'Agata Bridge that had already been damaged 22 years earlier. On the 4th of November 2011, 6 people died in Genoa, 2 of them children. In October 2014, the water came through the covered section once more, wrecked the streets around the station, and killed a man. 4 destructive floods in 50 years, in the same valley, from the same cause. The response has been to build a bypass, a diversion tunnel designed to take roughly 400 cubic meters per second away from the natural channel before it reaches the covered stretch. It has been in planning since the 1980s. The construction site is still active. And out on the hillsides, the other half of the water problem has been quietly getting worse. Remember the terraces, the dry stone walls that hold the slope and let the rain drain through slowly. In the Vernazza Basin, in the Cinque Terre, researchers compared aerial photographs and land records from the early 1950s to the present. Over roughly 60 years, 77% of the terraced land was abandoned. On the 25th of October 2011, an extreme rainfall event hit that coast. Hundreds of shallow landslides broke loose above Vernazza and Monterosso. Debris and mud came down the channels and went through both villages. Afterwards, a research team led by geomorphologists, including Pierluigi Brandolini and Andrea Cevasco, did something unusual. They had laser survey data of the ground from before the storm. They flew it again afterwards and subtracted one surface from the other, which let them measure exactly how much material had moved and from where. The answer was unambiguous. The failures clustered on abandoned terraces. Where walls had been maintained, the slope largely held. Where the walls had crumbled, water pooled behind the collapsed sections, saturated the fill, and took the hillside with it. The terraces were never decoration. They were the structure of the mountain. 6 centuries of hand-stacked stone were the only reason the slope stayed put. And when the last generation of farmers stopped rebuilding them, the mountain began to come down. The question asked earlier has its answer. What happens to a slope rebuilt by hand for 600 years when the hands stop? It moves, and it is measurable. There is one more thing the terrain did to this city, and it is the thing visitors notice first without understanding what they are looking at. Genoa's historic centre covers about 113 hectares. It is the largest continuously inhabited medieval core in Europe. That statistic is usually presented as a matter of preservation, a city lucky enough to keep its old town. It is not luck. It is compression. The alleys are called caruggi. Many are around 2 meters wide. The buildings on either side run to 6 or 7 stories, in stone and slate, packed shoulder to shoulder, with no setback and no gardens. Walk into the middle of it, and the daylight goes to a narrow band overhead. The materials tell the same story as the geometry. Underfoot in the old town, the paving is slate. On the roofs above it, slate again. Around the doorways, in the window frames, on the fronts of buildings, in the wash basins and the fireplaces, slate. It comes from the Fontana Buona Valley, inland behind the eastern coast, where the same crushed and folded rock belt that gives Liguria its poor soil also splits cleanly into thin, flat, weatherproof sheets. There was no timber to spare, because the accessible woodland was going into ships and charcoal. There was no brick clay worth the name, because that requires deep alluvial ground, and there is none. So the city built itself out of the one thing the mountains produced in quantity. Ligurian slate was quarried, split by hand, carried down the valley, and shipped along the coast for centuries. It went into churches, palaces, and tenements alike. It is why the old town reads dark grey in the rain, and why the roofs of half this region are the same colour as the hillsides behind them. A city looks the way its geology allows. Here, that is unusually literal. This is what happens when a city cannot expand. There was no land to build outward onto, so every plot was subdivided, every building went up, and every gap between them was reduced to the minimum a loaded porter could pass through. The density was not a style, it was arithmetic. And that density produced its own world. The caruggi held the people who made the port work. Dockers, rope makers, sailors between voyages, bakers, and everyone living at the edge of the trade rather than at the top of it. The grand palaces of the merchant families stood a few hundred meters uphill on the wide street they built to display them. The two lived within earshot of each other. Fabrizio de André, born here in 1940, spent much of his working life writing about the second group and not the first. His songs are populated by the people of the alleys, the poor, the drunk, the sex workers, the ones the city's official story left out. He wrote a whole album in the Genoese dialect. He died in 1999, and he remains, for a great many Italians, the voice of this place. A city squeezed into 2 meters of street width develops a very particular interior life. The alleys are dark, the doors are closed, and everyone can hear everyone. That is the geometry of a place with nowhere left to go. So here is the account so far. A shelf of poor rock, 30 kilometres long and 10 deep. Soil too thin and too steep to farm without rebuilding the mountain by hand. Rainfall heavy enough to take that mountain apart. 2 torrent valleys that are simultaneously the only way inland and the reason the city floods. A coastline of cliff with 1 usable harbour. A food culture assembled out of chickpeas, wild greens, and imported cheese. A population that left, generation after generation, because the ground could not hold it. Every one of those is a liability. And this place became one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean for 600 years. There has to be something on the other side of the ledger. One geographic fact large enough to outweigh all of it. There is. It is 472 meters above sea level, about 20 kilometers north of the harbour, and almost nobody stops there. The Passo dei Giovi is not impressive to look at. A road, a saddle in the ridge, woods on both sides, a sign. Cyclists ride over it as a warm-up. From the top, you cannot see the sea. But stand there and understand what you are standing on. The Apennines run the length of Italy as a continuous barrier between the Mediterranean coast and the interior. In the north, the interior is the Po Basin, the largest area of flat, deep, well-watered farmland in southern Europe, and, later, its greatest concentration of manufacturing. Milan sits in it. Turin sits at its western edge. Beyond it are the Alpine passes into France, Switzerland, and the whole of northern Europe. For all of that ground, the sea is on the wrong side of a mountain range. And at Genoa, the range drops to its lowest usable crossing on the entire northern stretch. 472 meters. A gradient a mule train can take loaded, and later a railway can take with tunnels. Measure it in distance and it becomes obvious. Milan is about 120 kilometers from this harbour. There is no closer saltwater, not on the Adriatic, not further down the Tyrrhenian coast. The nearest sea to the richest plain in the region is here, through this gap, and it has been here since the plain was farmed. So the same mountain wall did two opposite things at once. It took away the fields. It removed the river, the delta, the grazing, the grain, every ordinary basis on which a city is normally founded. And it made this exact stretch of coast the shortest line between the open sea and half the wealth of Italy. That is the answer. That is the whole thing. Genoa did not become a maritime power despite having no farmland. It became one because of it. And it became one here, rather than at any of the 100 other coves along this coast, because of a low point in a ridge. A city that cannot grow food must buy it. To buy it, it needs something to sell. What Genoa had to sell was access. Everything moving between the Mediterranean and the northern interior had to cross the mountains, and the cheapest crossing was over the ridge behind this harbour. Grain went inland. Salt went inland. Cloth, alum, spices, timber, iron. And Genoese ships carried them, because the port at the bottom of the pass belonged to the people who had already learned to move cargo for their own survival. The tools they had invented to guarantee their own wheat supply turned out to work on anything. Contracts that spread risk across many investors. Shares in a voyage that could be bought and sold. Ways of settling debts in one city against credit in another, so that value could travel without a single coin leaving a strongbox. Those instruments were built by a hungry port. Within a few centuries, they were moving sums larger than the treasuries of the kingdoms that used them, and Genoese credit had become one of the load-bearing structures of European commerce. That is a different story, told in a different kind of ledger, and it is not this one. What matters here is where it started. It started with a mountain that would not grow wheat, and a pass low enough to carry it over. The route never stopped being the route. In the 1850s, engineers drove a railway from Turin to Genoa through the Giovi Ridge, one of the earliest and most difficult mountain lines in Europe, worked at gradients that pushed the locomotives of the day to their limit. Today, the motorway runs through the same corridor, on viaducts, in tunnels, following the shape of the Polcevera Valley toward the same saddle. 2,000 years of traffic, and it has never moved more than a few kilometers either side of the line the Romans cut in 148 BC. Because there is nowhere else for it to go. So, why is there a city here at all? Because this is the one place on a wall of mountains where the wall gets low. Everything else, the fleet, the alleys, the terraces, the chickpea bread, the palaces, the money, is what people built while living next to that gap on ground that could not feed them. The land gave them one advantage and took everything else. They spent 600 years turning that single advantage into all the rest. The city that grew out of it is smaller now than it was. Genoa peaked in the second half of the 20th century and has been shrinking since. The wider region has gone with it. Between 1991 and 2001, Liguria recorded the largest population decline of any Italian region, a fall of more than 6% at a time when the country as a whole was still growing. In 2001, around 11,400 children were born in Liguria. Around 21,400 people died. Today, it is the oldest region in Italy, and one of the oldest anywhere in Europe. The average Ligurian is approaching 50. For every 100 residents under 14, there are close to 280 over 65. The number matters more here than it would elsewhere, because of what maintenance means on this terrain. The walls on those hillsides do not hold themselves. They were kept upright by people who lived beside them and repaired them every year. Terraces are not a monument. They are a chore, repeated for 6 centuries, and the chore has largely stopped. The mountain is still shedding water. The stone is still coming loose. What has changed is the number of hands. Out at sea, there is one more absence worth naming. The Mediterranean monk seal was once ordinary along this coast. It hauled out in sea caves, bred in the coves under the cliffs, and appears in the records of coastal communities as a normal part of the shoreline. It is now one of the most endangered marine mammals on Earth. It did not go because of any single event. It went because the caves filled with boats, the beaches filled with people, and the coast that had 100 quiet places became a coast with almost none. A small number are still occasionally detected in these waters, not usually seen. Found instead by cameras left in sea caves, and by testing seawater for fragments of DNA the animal has shed simply by swimming through it. Which is a strange way to know that something is alive. A trace in the water, from a creature nobody watched arrive. Perhaps that is the fitting note to end on, in a place like this. Genoa was never a city that the land wanted. Every good thing here was extracted from a refusal. Flat ground made by stacking stone. Bread made from a crop that is not a grain. A harbour found in the only gap for 200 kilometres. And a fortune built on a low point in a ridge that nobody would look at twice. The mountains have not softened. The rain has not eased. The terraces are still there, holding on where they can, and coming apart where nobody is left to mend them. What the land decided, it decided a long time ago, and it has not revised the term. Everything Genoa is was assembled inside them. Thanks for watching. If you would like to keep traveling with us, subscribe, and we will see you on the next journey.